Good day, everybody. Welcome back to our subject, our readings in Philippine history. And now we are in the chapter 3, which is all about the Philippine history. We'll be talking about the spaces for conflict and controversies. So with this, let me share with you on board the learning objectives of our chapter 3. First, we are going to interpret historical events using primary source. Second is to recognize the multiplicity of interpretation that can be read from a historical text. Third is to identify the advantages and disadvantages of employing critical tools in interpreting historical events through primary source. And lastly, to demonstrate ability to argue for or against a particular issue using primary source. So what we'll discuss? We'll be discussing about making sense of the past, historical interpretation, code of Kalantiaw, sa aking mga kabata, and multiperspectivity. So let's start with the making sense of the past, historical interpretation, code of Kalantiaw, sa aking mga kabata, and multiperspectivity. So with this, making sense of the past, we want to make sense of the past and knowing the story behind that, and that's the way making sense of the past. So in this chapter, we are going to analyze the 4 historiographical problems in Philippine history in an attempt to apply what we have learned thus far in the work of a historian and the process of historical inquiry. So now, what are the 2 concepts that need to be defined before proceeding to the historical analysis of problems in history? So unsa maning duha ka concept nga dapat nato mahibal-an before we are going to discuss the 4 historiographical problems in Philippine history. First is the interpretation and the multi-perspectivity. So of course, we all know naman that historical interpretation, this is how a historian analyze, examine, scrutinize the historical past events. Mga na siya, no? And ang interpretation, mao ni siya nga nag-indicate sa action sa historian in explaining the meaning of something or explaining the past events. So in the context of history, ang interpretation nag-refer ni siya the way ang historian mag-analyze and examine or explain sa mga past events. And take note that different historians may provide lahi-lahi nga interpretations based sa ilahang perspectives, biases, and the available evidences to interpret the past with the concept and helps nga masabtan ang lahi-lahi nga historical viewpoints, and that is interpretation. How about this multi-perspectivity? Unsay naa dinhi? Mao ni ang more than one perspective that is represented to the reader or people nga nag-study ana nga certain past events, or in short, the word multi, no? From the word multi pa lang daan, daghan siya or daghan siya perspective. So therefore, we can say that multi-perspectivity in history involves considering multiple perspectives or viewpoints kung mag-study and interpret sa mga historical events. And of course, ang kanyang concept nga multiperspectivity, it helped us para ma-avoid ang atong one-sided or biased view of history and para sa maka-encourage ta og more inclusive analysis in historical events. So in short, ang multiperspectivity, madaming pananaw. Okay? So now, let's proceed. So, ato sang balikan kung unsa ang history. Kaya bang singaling tanan nato ang history, no? Kaya because isa ni siya sa foundation for us to make sense of the past. No? Na dapat din nato malimtan what's the meaning of history. So, history is the study of the past. No? We already discussed this in our prelim. But the more contemporary definition is centered on how it impacts the present through its consequences. So hatagan natong sense or pagtagad ang mga historical interpretation para ma-aware ta if tinuod ba jud nga siya tinuod ba na siya nga story or himo-himo ra siya. Next, according to Geoffrey Barak law, gidefine niyang history as the attempt to discover on the basis of fragmentary evidence the significant things about the past. So, a little background about Geoffrey Barak law. No? Geoffrey Barak law was a historian and an author and naghatag siya definition of history, no? Nga nagpasabot about sa importance or sa importansya sa historical research nga need sa mga historians nga dapat careful sila sa ilahang gibuhat nga research to navigate the gaps and limitations in the available evidence. Therefore, sa iyang definition no, ni Geoffrey Barak law, it emphasizes the importance of identifying and focusing on the key elements that contribute to a meaningful understanding of the past. So mauna siya ang emphasize ni Geoffrey Barak law. And diba, we already discussed in the previous discussion about the historical interpretation, nga ang historical interpretation that is involves the theories and examinations of the past. And also historical interpretation depend on the person or sa historian. Next. Geoffrey also notes that history we read, though based on facts, is strictly speaking not factual at all, but a series of accepted judgments. Therefore, ang kaniyang statement nga giingon ni Geoffrey Barak law, it underscores a dynamic process of interpretation, and different historians may offer different interpretations of the same historical events. Mauning mugawas dayon si multiperspectivity, which is more than one perspective that is represented to the reader or people nga nag-study ana nga certain past events. Next is such judgments of historians on how the past should be seen make the foundation of historical interpretation. That means the judgment made by historians shape the way we understand and interpret the past. And historians, take note ha, ang historians, nag-utilize sila facts collected from primary sources of history and then draw their own reading so that their intended audience may understand the historical events in the process that in essence make sense of the past. So the premise is not only or is that not all, because primary sources are accessible to a general audience. Take note ha, primary sources are accessible to a general audience. And without the proper training and background, ang non-historian or kanang mga dili historian interpreting a primary source may do harm than good. And a primary source may even cause misunderstanding, sometimes pa jud ana, resulting in more problems. Diba? And interpretation of the past therefore vary according to kinsa ang nagbasa ana nga primary source, kanus ana siya gibasa nga primary source, o giunsa niya na siya pagbasa nga primary source. And as a student of history, kamo, you must be all equipped to recognize different types of interpretations, why this may differ from each other, and how critically sift this interpretation through historical evaluation. And here, interpretations of historical events change over time. So mag-change na siya every generation to generation. Thus, it is an important skill for a student, kamo, student of history, to track these changes in an attempt to understand the past. So now, we're going to track some of the historical events that change over time. First, we have this, making sense of the past of Code of Kalantiaw. Code of Kalantiaw is a mythical legal code in the epic history of Maragtas. It was a source of pride for the people of Aklan. Sa Aklan ni siya ang Code of Kalantiaw before it was revealed as a hoax or kanang malicious, or the other definition of malicious is numerous, but it was revealed as a malicious or a humorous. A historical marker was installed in the town of Batan in Aklan, year 1956, with the following text. So, tanawon ko kung say sulod aning mythical code na Code of Kalantiaw. So, si Dato Bendihara Kalantiaw, siya ang third chief of Panay nga gipanganak sa Aklan. Nag-establish siya og iyang government in Peninsula of Batang Aklan, Sakop. Considered the first Filipino law giver, si Dato Bendihara Kalantiaw. Dato Bendihara Kalantiaw promulgated in about 1433 a penal code known as penal code ang penal code mo na siya ang mga about penalties, mo na siya ang penal code. Again, in about 1433 a penal code now known as the Code of Kalantiaw, nga nga naani siya 18 ka articles. And si Don Marcelino Aurelia of Zaragoza, Spain, he obtained the original manuscript daw from an old chief of Panay, which was later translated into Spanish ni Rafael Morviedo Zamane. So maglibog na tadaan, no? Kung kinsa jud ang nagbuhat aning Code of Kalantiaw. Kay giingon diri si Dato Bendihara Kalantiaw daw. O nya na po dinhi nga kang Don Marcelino Aurelia nga gi-translate into Spanish ni Rafael Morviado Zamenay. Next, it proved as a hoax in 1968. No, when William Henry Scott, nanapod si William Henry Scott, ang tanawon sa iyang role din niya. When William Henry Scott, then a doctoral candidate at the University of Santo Tomas, defended his research on pre-Hispanic resources in Philippine history. So William Henry Scott attributed the code to a historical fiction. Oh, historical fiction daw siya, written in 1913 ni Jose A. Marco, titled Las Antiguas Leyendas de las Islas de Negros, or in English translation, the ancient legends of the island of Negros. So, di na ito makita, lahi na po ang nagsulat daw si Jose E. Marco. And Marco, attributed the code itself to a priest named Jose Maria Pavon. Nanapod si Jose Maria Pavon, ikapila naman eh. And the prominent Filipino historian did not dissent to Scott's findings, but there are still some who would like to believe that the code is a legitimate document. Therefore, a non-historian interpreting a primary source may do harm than good. A primary source even causes misunderstanding and sometimes even resulting in more problems. Next, interpretation of the past, therefore, may vary. No, gibalik na ni kagay na who reads the primary source, when it was read, and how it was read. So, of course, as a student of history, you must be well equipped to recognize different types of interpretation, why this may differ from each other, and many more. Because interpretation of historical events change over time. Thus, it is an important skill for a student of history to track these changes in an attempt to understand the past. So now we're going to track another historical events that change over time. Again, in the Code of Kalantiaw, it is clear na wala tay makita nga specific person kung kinsa jud ang nagbuhat aning Code of Kalantiaw. And that's the sense of making, and that's the sense of the past. No? Next, another. Making sense of the past sa aking mga kabata. Are you familiar with this poem? Di ba? Tatanawin. Sa aking mga kabata is a poem purportedly written by Rizal. Again, purportedly. Kung ato na siyang i-Tagalog, di umano. Di ba? Sa aking mga kabata is a poem. So, poem dyan na siya. Pero, purportedly written by Jose Rizal when he was 8 years old and is probably one of Rizal's most prominent works. This poem, there is no evidence to support. Claro ha? There is no evidence to support the claim that this poem with the now immortalized line, ang hindi magmahal sa kaniyang salita, mahigit sa hayop at malansang isda, was written by Rizal. And worse, the evidence against Rizal authorship of the poem seems all unassailable or not liable. There exists no manuscript of the poem nga nag-ingon nga si Rizal ang nagsulat ani nga poem sa aking mga kabata. Again, wala daw ni exist na manuscript of the poem handwritten by Rizal. The poem was first published in 1906 by Hermenegildo Cruz. Take note ha, ang pinakauna daw nga nag-publish ani nga poem si Hermenegildo Cruz in 1906. And Hermenegildo, he received the poem from Gabriel Beato Francisco na claimed to have received it in 1884 from Rizal's close friend nga si Saturnino Rasiles. Di ba? Gipasa-pasa na po. However, Rizal never mentioned writing this poem anywhere in his writings. And more importantly, katawanan kayo, and never mentioned having a close friend by the person of Rasiles. So therefore, no original manuscript in Rizal's own hand exists for sa aking mga kabata, traditionally believed to be his first poem. And it is important, therefore, to subject to evaluation not only the primary source, but also the historical interpretation of the same to ensure that the current interpretation is reliable to support or acceptance of events of the past. Now, it's clear ha nga there is no manuscript nga nag-ingon nga handwritten ni Rizal ang sa aking mga kabata. In short, gipasa-pasa pa po hinoon siya. Diba? And here, making sense of the past, we'll be talking about the multiperspectivity. It is defined as a way of looking at historical events, personalities, developments, cultures, and societies from different perspectives. This means that there is a multitude of ways by which we can view the world. And historical writing is, by definition, biased, partial, and contains preconceptions. Therefore, the historians decides on what sources to use, what interpretation to make more apparent, depending on what his end is. And historians may misinterpret evidence, attending to those that suggest that a certain event happened and then ignore the rest of goes against the evidence. Also, historians may omit, di ba no? Mo siya, historians may omit significant facts about their subject, which makes the interpretation unbalanced and impose a certain ideology to their subject, which may not be appropriate to the period of the subject was from. And historians may also provide a single cause for an event without considering other possible casual explanation of the said events. And with multi-perspectivity as an approach in history, again, it is an approach in history. We must understand that historical interpretations contain discrepancies, contradictions, ambiguities, and are often the focus of dissent. Exploring multiple perspectives in history requires incorporating source materials that reflect different views of an event sa history. Because kung isa lang na historical narratives do not provide or space to inquire and investigate kung isa lang imuhang historical evidence. And different sources that counter each other may create space for more investigation and research while providing more evidences for those truths that these sources agree on. Therefore, in conclusion, different kinds of sources also provide different historical truths, and official document may not different may note different aspect of the past than say a memure of an ordinary person on the same event. And it proves for the audience a more complex, but also a more complete and richer understanding of the past. So for the next video presentation, we are going to know kung unsa jud ang kaning upat ka historiographical problems in Philippine history, which are the case studies. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening our discussion about the introduction of our chapter 3. Thank you so much.